April 1945. The world's most brutal empire was collapsing into fire and rubble. Soviet artillery thundered day and night, shaking Berlin to its foundations. The once proud avenues of the Reichstag, Unter den Linden, and Wilhelmstrasse had become corridors of death, choked with smoke, burning timber, and the stench of unburied corpses. Civilians huddled like phantoms in the U-Bahn tunnels, their faces gaunt, eyes wide from sleepless nights under bombardment. Above them, the city burned, a pyre for Hitler's empire. Inside the Führerbunker, despair rotted the air. Hitler raved, his generals lied, and the walls groaned as Soviet shells pounded closer each hour. It was here, in this labyrinth of concrete and fear, that one of the Reich's most terrifying men was last seen. Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo. The man whose signature condemned thousands to torture, execution, or the death camps. A figure known for silence, precision, and ruthlessness. Then, nothing. When Berlin finally fell, bodies littered the streets. The Soviets dug pits for the dead, dragging out uniforms, medals, boots caked in ash. Himmler's corpse would be found. Goebbels and his family lay charred outside the bunker. Hitler's ashes smoldered in a shell crater. But Müller vanished. No grave. Nobody. No witnesses. Just absence. For survivors of his reign, that silence was worse than death. The man who had perfected administrative murder had slipped through the firestorm, leaving behind only whispers. Some swore he died in the ruins. Others claimed he fled with false papers. As weeks turned into years, the absence grew monstrous. Müller was not just another fugitive. He was the ghost of Berlin, a man who embodied the dark machinery of the Reich, now swallowed by shadows. And so began one of the most brutal manhunts of the 20th century. The Allies, the Soviets, and later the CIA and Mossad would chase his trail across continents. But in April 1945, as Berlin burned and Hitler's empire crumbled to dust, Müller simply vanished into history's black hole. Before the collapse, Heinrich Müller was not a household name like Himmler or Goebbels. He was something far more dangerous, a man who thrived in silence. Born a Bavarian policeman, he climbed the ranks not through charisma or speeches, but through cold efficiency. Colleagues remembered him as a man of short words, a smoker hunched over his desk late into the night, capable of recalling entire interrogation files without ever opening a folder. When he was appointed chief of the Gestapo in 1939, Müller became the iron heartbeat of Hitler's secret police. It was through his office that lists of Jews, political opponents, and suspected traitors passed. His signature sealed their fates: deportation to Auschwitz, execution by firing squad, or endless nights of torture in the basements of Prinz Albrechtstrasse. He didn't need speeches or rallies. His power was ink, stamps, and silence. This made him terrifying. Unlike Eichmann, who reveled in conferences, or Goebbels, who bathed in propaganda, Müller kept to the shadows. Few photographs exist of him, stern, rigid, never smiling. In group portraits he is a blurred figure, indistinguishable from the uniforms around him. He cultivated anonymity, and it became his greatest weapon. Even among the inner circle, Müller was a ghost. And yet, in the machinery of the Reich, he was indispensable. He oversaw the hunt for resistance networks like the Red Orchestra. He managed counterintelligence, sabotage reports, and executions. He turned repression into a routine, as if murder were nothing more than paperwork. Survivors of his office later recalled his chilling calmness. He signed death like others signed invoices. That quiet precision elevated him to one of the Allies' most wanted criminals. When the war ended, they compiled lists of fugitives to be hunted at all costs. At the top was Martin Bormann, Hitler's right hand. In second place, above Adolf Eichmann himself, was Heinrich Müller. To capture him would be to strike at the dark heart of the Gestapo. But when the guns fell silent, the Allies discovered a nightmare. Unlike Bormann, unlike Himmler, unlike Goebbels, Müller had left nobody behind. He was already playing the role he knew best, the man without a shadow. The fall of the Reich left behind a blacklist, a roll call of monsters who had to be found at any cost. The Allies knew the world demanded justice. At the top was Martin Bormann, Hitler's elusive deputy. Below him, in the second slot, was Heinrich Müller. Not Eichmann. Not Mengele. Not the other faces of genocide. It was the quiet, faceless chief of the Gestapo. Why? Because Müller had been more than just a bureaucrat. He was the architect of silence. His reach extended from Berlin to every Gestapo branch in occupied Europe. Resistance networks feared his reports. Prisoners vanished into cells under his authority, their fates sealed by initials scrawled in the margin of a page. He signed off on the execution of captured Allied pilots. He approved deportations to the death camps. His office orchestrated the interrogation of spies, partisans, and dissidents. In war, fear was a weapon, and Müller wielded it with terrifying precision. As Germany collapsed, Allied investigators knew what his capture would mean. Not only justice, but intelligence. Müller carried in his head the secrets of the Gestapo's vast network, details of Soviet espionage groups like the Red Orchestra, and the files of countless informants. To seize him was to seize the mind of the Gestapo itself. But the search was maddening. Posters with his face circulated across occupied zones. Wanted lists stamped his name as a priority target. Yet Müller never appeared. No arrests. No credible sightings. While Göring sat in the dock at Nuremberg, and Eichmann would eventually be dragged from Argentina, Müller dissolved like smoke. That absence fed his legend. Rumors began to spread that he had died in the rubble of Berlin, that he had escaped through the Alps into Switzerland, that he was hidden by secret accounts abroad. Each version was reinforced by the same horrifying truth: no body, no grave, no closure. The Allies called him the black hole of post-war justice. Survivors called him the man who killed with a pen. And as the hunt dragged on, Müller's rank as the second most wanted man in the world transformed him into something worse than a fugitive. He became a ghost, one that taunted both victors and victims alike. Berlin, May 1945. The city was a graveyard of fire and stone. Soviet tanks thundered through the streets, while SS men burned documents in the ruins of ministries. In the chaos, one man slipped from history: Heinrich Müller. His last confirmed sighting came on May 1st. Witnesses recalled him in the Führerbunker, uniform neat despite the dust, calmly declaring he would never fall into Russian hands. After that, nothing. No one saw him die. No one saw him leave. He vanished as the rye crumbled, a phantom stepping into the smoke. The Allies scoured Germany. Graves were exhumed. Anonymous corpses were checked against dental records. Informants whispered of a Gestapo chief shot while trying to break through Soviet lines, or poisoned in the bunker like so many others. Yet no corpse matched Müller. Soviet archives later revealed their own frustration. They had captured thousands of Nazis, but never Gestapo Müller. That silence grew louder with every year. The CIA and MI6 feared the worst. What if Müller had defected? The man knew every anti-Soviet spy network in occupied Europe. He had overseen the hunt for the Red Orchestra, a Soviet espionage ring. If alive, his knowledge was priceless. And in the new world of 1946, justice was no longer the only goal. Information was power. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed he was smuggled into South America with other fugitives. Others swore the Soviets had captured him, hiding him in Moscow's prisons as an intelligence asset. Files declassified decades later revealed the paranoia of Western agencies, frantic memos speculating on Müller's survival, reports of possible sightings, and desperate attempts to trace the untraceable. The trail was a nightmare. No photographs after 1945, no verified letters, no financial records. Unlike Eichmann, who left faint ripples in Argentina, Müller left nothing. And in intelligence circles, nothing was the most frightening evidence of all. For families of his victims, his absence was unbearable. They wanted a trial, a noose, an ending. Instead, they were given a riddle. Heinrich Müller had perfected invisibility in life, and now, in death, he had transformed it into legend. As Europe shifted from the ashes of war into the chill of the Cold War, the name Heinrich Müller refused to die. Each year that passed without a body made the question more terrifying. Had the Gestapo chief survived? And worse, whose side was he on now? To the Americans, the thought was chilling. Müller had overseen counterintelligence against Soviet networks. He knew the names of infiltrators, the methods of resistance groups, the structure of underground cells. If the Russians had him, they possessed a living encyclopedia of Nazi intelligence. If the West sheltered him, they would be accused of harboring a war criminal. Either way, his ghost distorted the fragile balance of trust. By the early 1950s, reports trickled into CIA files: Müller spotted in Czechoslovakia. Müller living in Moscow under a new identity. Müller protected in Soviet-controlled East Berlin. None were ever confirmed, but each fueled the paranoia. One CIA memo described him as the most dangerous unaccounted-for Nazi. Another concluded, if alive, Müller is almost certainly in Soviet hands. The Soviets, of course, denied everything. Yet their silence only deepened suspicion. Western agencies imagined Müller in some dark prison cell, bartering Gestapo files for survival. or worse, training Stalin's own secret police, teaching them how to break men in the same way he had broken dissidents in Berlin. In the absence of truth, legends spread. Some survivors swore they had glimpsed him in South America, drinking quietly in bars filled with fugitives. Others claimed he had been executed by his own men in the chaos of Berlin. Each story contradicted the other, but together they kept his spectre alive. For Holocaust survivors, the rumors were unbearable. Eichmann had been dragged into the light, tried, and executed. But Müller, the man who signed countless deportations, remained untouchable. To them, his escape felt like an insult carved into history. And so, Heinrich Müller became more than a fugitive. He became a weapon of fear, a figure whispered about in the backrooms of intelligence agencies, a man who may have been dead, or who may have been advising the enemy all along. The Gestapo's chief had dissolved into the Cold War, where truth and lies were weapons, and his absence was as terrifying as his presence had once been. Decades passed, but Heinrich Müller's shadow refused to fade. In 1963, as the world reeled from Adolf Eichmann's execution in Israel, German investigators turned their gaze once more toward the Gestapo chief. If Eichmann could be found after hiding in Argentina, then surely Müller's trail could be uncovered. They began with the graves. In Berlin's old cemeteries, under rows of crumbling crosses and unmarked stones, rumors spoke of Müller's body buried in secret. Grave diggers were questioned, wartime files re-examined, survivors interviewed. At one site near Lilienthalstrasse, a corpse was exhumed, the bones of a man in a Nazi uniform, shot in the head. For a moment, hope surged. Has the ghost finally been caught? But forensic study crushed the revelation. The remains belonged not to Müller, but to another SS officer. Once again, the trail collapsed into silence. The mystery thickened in the 1970s when new claims emerged. Müller was alive in Moscow. Defectors whispered of a former Gestapo man advising the KGB, teaching interrogation methods to Stalin's successors. The CIA noted the reports but could never confirm them. Meanwhile, German prosecutors publicly admitted what survivors already feared: Müller had evaded justice completely. The real blow came in 2013, when newly uncovered files revealed investigators had indeed found traces of Müller's corpse in 1945, but in a mass grave at a Berlin cemetery. According to the report, he had been buried in a pit with other Nazi officials, still wearing his Gestapo uniform. Yet the evidence was fragmented, incomplete, never fully verified. Skeptics dismissed it as too little, too late. The files raised more questions than answers. Why no photographs? Why no precise records? Why had this revelation stayed hidden for nearly 70 years? To many, it looked less like closure and more like another layer of smoke in the fog of post-war justice. The climax of the hunt was not triumph, but frustration. Müller's grave, if it existed, was nameless, faceless, and lost in the rubble of history. For the victims of the Gestapo, the silence was deafening. Justice had slipped through their fingers, leaving behind only the most haunting truth of all: the world's second most wanted man had become the perfect disappearance. By the end of the 20th century, Heinrich Müller had become less a man and more a shadow burned into history. His name was no longer written in arrest warrants but in the anguished testimonies of survivors. Each family who had lost someone to the Gestapo carried the wound of his absence, the unbearable knowledge that their tormentor had never faced trial, never sat in judgment, never answered for the signatures that condemned thousands. In courtrooms across Europe, Nazi criminals were exposed, interrogated, humiliated under the weight of evidence. Men like Eichmann, Hoss, and Spee became symbols of reckoning. But Müller was absent from the dock. His chair was always empty, his name always followed by silence. For many, that silence was more painful than a verdict. Historians wrestled with the puzzle. Some argued Müller had died in the ruins of Berlin, his bones already part of the soil beneath forgotten cemeteries. Others insisted he lived on, perhaps in Moscow, perhaps under a false name in South America. The debate itself became part of his legacy, a constant reminder that justice is fragile, that evil does not always meet its end in the light of truth. For survivors, there was no such luxury of speculation. To them, Müller was not a riddle but a thief. He had stolen not only lives but the chance for closure. Every unanswered question kept the pain alive. His disappearance became a second crime, one committed not with bullets or papers, but with silence. Even within intelligence circles, Müller's name never entirely faded. Old CIA files, opened decades later, still carried the same unease. What if he survived? What if he had switched allegiances? His ghost lingered in the very agencies that once hunted him. And so, Heinrich Müller's legacy was not written in capture or confession, but in absence. He was a man whose life work was terror, and whose final act was to escape memory itself, leaving behind only the echo of doors slamming in Gestapo basements, and the chilling realization that justice does not always prevail. History remembers monsters best when they fall. Goring in his cell, Himmler swallowing poison, Eichmann on the gallows, their ends were brutal, visible, undeniable. But Heinrich Müller was different. He left behind no photograph of death, no final words, no body lowered into the ground. His grave was the silence itself. For decades, that silence has haunted both historians and survivors. Each theory, the Moscow cell, the South American exile, the Berlin mass grave, only deepened the uncertainty. And in that uncertainty lies his final power. Müller, the bureaucrat of death, who thrived in shadows during life, achieved in death what no other Nazi leader managed: he disappeared. But absence is not the same as escape. His deeds remain carved into archives and testimonies. His signature lingers on execution orders, his initials on deportation lists. Survivors remembered his cold efficiency, the way he treated life and death as paperwork. Even without a body, the weight of those acts remains. Müller may have denied the world his confession, but he could not erase the echo of his crimes. The man who was once the world's second most wanted fugitive is today a symbol of unfinished justice. He represents the fragility of truth in the face of chaos, the way war scatters answers into dust. His story is not one of capture or redemption, but of disappearance, a void that reminds us evil does not always meet a clean ending. In the end, Heinrich Müller's fate is less important than what it reveals. Justice can be delayed. Truth can be buried. But memory endures. For every unanswered question, there are the voices of the lost, the names on the lists he signed, the shadows of those who never came home. The Gestapo chief may have vanished into history's smoke, but his absence is its own verdict. Heinrich Müller will be remembered, not as a man, not even as a fugitive, but as a chilling reminder that some ghosts are never laid to rest.